welcome to Sunday Science Q&A, which has become a regular thing over the last 5 weeks. And I'll tell you a couple of things. First of all, today we are joined, as usual, by Helen Czerski. We have Professor Brian Cox back, and also I'll give you some other news there, which is we are currently working out how to do the Infinite Monkey Cage from home. So we're going to do a very different version, but this week we're going to be doing all the mic tests and stuff like that. So there's going to be a new series of the Infinite Monkey Cage. And we're also joined by a man who is just a polymath, a wonderful scientist, very often in terms of understanding ideas of evolutionary biology, sometimes entomology, and his latest book is all about the human brain and how much we don't know. So it's a really big book 'cause it's about what we don't know. It's enormous. It's a book of infinity. Borges would probably write a book about the book of what is not known about the brain. That would exist in one of his labyrinths, and that is Matthew Cobb. So we're going to join Matthew in a moment. Quickly to tell you that next week on the 10 a.m. show with Josie Long, we've got Mark Gatiss is on Monday. We've got Sophie Hagen coming up, the poet Luke Wright. We've got Marcus Brigstock, Rachel Paris. We've also got Richard Wiseman on Friday, and we've got Dr. Carl on Tuesday as well. So any questions you have for Dr. Carl, we'll be going live to him. That's at 10 a.m. And the final thing to tell you is we have a tip jar at the bottom of this, and we have been building up a resource of money for the arts industry for various people who you might have seen in the news that about 85%, for instance, of comedians have not had any form of government support or anything as yet, and they have no work. This is not the comedians who have TV or radio or anything else. This is the club comics, as well as also musicians. And also we've been giving some of that money to art centres, and we've now given it all out. We've actually given everything that we had left. So we now need to build up a new resort. So I hope you enjoy this show, and I hope you enjoy all the shows we do. We're probably going to do another COVID-19 Q&A as well soon, and any money we get basically goes to helping people in the arts industry and helping the art centres, and then also being a resource so we can keep making these shows as well. Good morning, good afternoon. Here is Matthew Cobb. Hello Matthew. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Your book has had, I've got it here. I've got the cheap proof copy, the uncorrected proof copy. I know that the actual hardback version, which is in the shops but unavailable in many, many shops at the moment, is a beautiful. I mean, just to own the book alone, it is a magnificent thing, isn't it? I don't know if you've got a copy there. Golden inlay. I read the book. We've got a.
Gold.
Sure,
look
there,
gold. Shiny.
It is.
Gold.
Yes.
It was it's lovely end papers of neurons. It's got colour print. It's got colour pictures in it somewhere. There you go, colour pictures. Anyway, yes, a bargain.
Yeah, that was through research, wasn't it? That they realised that people into science communication had magpie-like minds and therefore were drawn to shiny covers as well. Look how shiny Brian's is as well. But this book is. It's taken you a while. Has this been the biggest project you've done in terms of as an author, looking both at, first of all, the history of how we came to know what we do know, and then this, the section at the end where the third section about how much work there is to be done.
This is. I mean, it took 4.5 years, something like that, to write it. So it was pretty hefty, and. It was not really the book I set out to write. I set out to write something different, and the original pitch was much simpler, and then it kind of got more complicated as it went on, and I had to grapple with all sorts of things that I'd either forgotten or had never learnt about. So it was quite an experience.
What for you was the most surprising? Because it is true. In the publishing industry, there are very often books brought out which, when you see them placed on the cover of the New Scientist, suggest that we have had another Damascene moment in understanding human consciousness. And then by the third paragraph, you go, oh, it seems we're a little bit further away than we thought. Was there anything that did kind of shock you and go, oh, I really thought we had got further with that?
Well, I think the main thing is what it underlined for me is quite how difficult it all is. So, I mean, I know that because... So I don't even study brains, right? My day job is studying single neurons, single smell cells, and trying to understand how they send information about the smells they detect to the brain. And I know how little we understand about that. So I've got a view that is very, very simple compared to people who study human beings. It should be said, I do have a degree in psychology, so I've I have studied these things many years ago. And I was so really it kind of confirmed my suspicions that a lot of the theories were just that, and there was very little empirical evidence to support them. I mean, when I was discussing this with my editor as I was writing it, he's saying, well, what's the explanation? What's the big idea? And I said, well, there isn't really one. You know, we haven't got the foggiest. People can't even agree what a brain is. And he said, well, you can't say that. People want an idea. You know, want to say. As it happens, it's turned out people go, well, this is remarkably refreshing. He's actually telling the truth. Nobody's got the foggiest.
I love the idea. They go, well, I can't give you an idea, but what if the book looks golden? Brilliant. Well, that's much better than having an idea. You've made a shiny book. It
was his idea, not mine, to have golden lettering. I was very impressed when I saw it. I didn't know until it popped through the letterbox.
Yeah, for those of you who haven't read Henry Marsh's really effusive review in the New Statesman, the first 7 paragraphs are about the choice of font. It's a really excellent review. But also, what about on the other side, where I was talking to Anil Seth, who's been on Monkey Cage in the past and writes very interestingly as a neuroscientist. And at the same time, in the 21st century, there are some leaps that have been made, aren't there, in terms of our understanding?
Yeah, absolutely. So the book's divided, well, into 3 halves, 3 parts, but they're not equal, really, into 2 halves, and then a little bit at the end, which is about the future. And so the idea is that from the middle of the 20th century onwards, basically that's the present. That's the model we're working with now, that brains are some kind of computational things. They are computing in some way. And what I did was to follow this through in all the various fields, whether it be memory or vision or the location perhaps of certain functions to certain parts of the brain, and then see how those ideas have been explored. Now, we've made absolutely astonishing advances. I mean, you know, people shouldn't get the idea this is dissing a whole field. Not at all. It's actually reveling in this incredible complexity and richness. So, you know, you can make a mouse remember something that it never experienced. If you give a mouse a nice experience, you can then change that literally at the flick of a switch by shining light into a nasty experience. The mouse is now afraid of a particular part of a cage rather than being happy about it. So we've got incredible control over this. I mean, it's just a paper, I haven't read it yet, there's a preprint come out from Doris Sau in America, and she's now looking at single cells in the face detecting area of a macaque, of a particular kind of monkey. And it's saying these cells actually seem to be processing the conscious impression, the perception of the face that it's looking at. And so there's an astonishing degree of precision. What's lacking is an overall theory and a way of pulling that together and then trying to explain exactly how this computation is going on, because brains aren't computers and neurons are not digital. They don't work like a bit of a computer at all. And ultimately, we've got this problem of trying to understand even relatively simple systems. So one of the themes that comes back is work of a woman called Eve Marder, who studies the lobster's stomach. So the lobster's got these 30 neurons in its stomach, which produce a kind of pulsing rhythm. So the muscles of the stomach can grind up the food. And she's been working for decades on this. She's really smart, and yet she can't model that system in a computer and predict what will happen if she takes out one particular neuron or alters its function. So even 30 neurons that aren't a brain, that's still beyond us.
And what's great about you mentioning the lobsters is now any fans of Jordan Peterson's book will go, oh, good, another lobster-based science examination. It's just what we needed. What I find fascinating, I'm reading your book and others as well, which is when you sometimes read about that idea of the brain in the vat. It was Descartes, wasn't it, who was the brain in the vat? And you go, there is kind of a possibility, isn't there, of a brain which could be stimulated in a way that the reality would be from just the early, some of those, there's inklings of that research when you're talking about the mouse brain, for instance, that idea.
That's what's happening, Robin. How do you know it's not what's happening? How do you know that you're not just a brain in a vat, bobbing about?
So that's what the lockdown's about. They found that some of the equipment's not working. They can't create such a kind of rich sensory experience. So they've had to just place us in the... Right, that's fully explained. Matthew, we'll come back to you. We've got loads of questions for you and Brian as well. Just before we go over to Brian, Helen, you have a show and tell today. What is your show and tell?
Well, yeah, so from, brains and great thoughts, I'm going to go to the brain that does like shiny things. And my show and tell randomly picked off the shelf back here. So this is a Paua shell from New Zealand. Now, we're all used to the idea of mollusk shells that have these beautiful iridescent patterns on the inside. The great thing about Paua, so Paua is what the Americans call abalone. What happens, this is the inside of the shell. But if you turn it over, the Maori and others have developed a habit of polishing off all the sort of seafloor looking stuff, the disguise on the outside, and what you can see is that the patterns are even better underneath. So this iridescent layer, it's not there because anything is going to see it, right? There's no evolutionary reason for it to be visually interesting. I do love the idea that the inner layer, the one that that no one is supposed to see, is even more beautiful than the obvious thing that washes up on the beach. But the interesting thing about this material is that they're platelets in here. They're little platelets of calcium carbonate embedded in organics, but they're incredibly strong, and the same structure that generates these patterns, which depend on temperature and genetics and all kinds of things. People are actually studying it because it's so strong and so flexible. It's a bit like bricks sort of glued together with cement. But anyway, so there's all this pretty structure in there. So I was looking at my shelf this morning, and I thought I would love to share this Paua shell with everyone. So there you go.
That is, the tenacity of beauty is a wonderful thing, isn't it? That is that's a beautiful object. That's what I always love about that thing, that every object, however, sometimes not like that, but sometimes banal, if you look close enough and you start, when we had Chris Jackson on the other week and talking about geology, and sometimes the simplest looking rock, and then you start to get the story of that journey over 4.6 billion years.
Or snail. So what people think of snails and go, ew, snail, yuck. But this is a marine snail. And so even in those creatures that we think of as yucky, because we haven't got the imagination to see that they're a bit more interesting than that, even in something that people would think ick. First of all, there are marine snails, which is cool all by itself. And then they've got all of this hidden inside them. So I love this.
Well, I know Brian doesn't find them icky. He's a bon viveur. He consumes them by the tub. Brian,
actually, because I'm interested, because if there's no evolutionary reason why those colours exist, why the structure looks so beautiful, it is the suggestion then that it purely is a byproduct of strength. And what's the selection power or effect? What's selecting for that kind of structure?
So it seems to be. So the reason, obviously, for the iridescence is that these little platelets are thin sheets, and the spacing between the sheets is similar to that of visible light. And the reason it's strong is that the protein in between provides flexibility, and those sheets provide rigidity. So you're right that there's no reason, but what I think there is if you look at how a cell can lay things down, it's going to come up with platelets that are about that big. And then it's how you use platelets to engineer strength. And not all so there's two ways that mollusks lay down stuff on the inside, and it's only some of them, the oysters, things that make mother of pearl, that do it this way. So I don't know. It was an interesting question, though, of how, because it is a coincidence, but it's also something where the material properties you need for strength, which are basically it's a material made of two things, right? You need rigid bits and you need soft bits, and it's that the arrangement of them happens at a scale which is the same as the scale of visible light. So yeah, I don't know. It'd be interesting. I wonder if you could recreate this, whether there's a maximum in the strength at that size scale, or whether it's all just luck. Don't know.
Or I suppose maybe it's a question, isn't it? Or whether the biology, as you said, maybe cells are of the order of the wavelength of light, and so they build structures which are of the order of the wavelength of visible light.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me like it's one of those things that are called a spandrel. So these are the bits when if you're having an arch holding up a building, you end up with these kind of these triangles between the arches, which in the Renaissance period, people then painted in, and so it looks like they're there for a reason, but they're not. They're simply a byproduct of other things. So this is what people are called spandrels. Bit of architectural history for you there.
But that's the Oscar Wilde thing, isn't it? That beauty is meant to be useless, isn't it? Beauty itself is, and the Ruskin quote, have nothing in your home apart from that which is practical and that which is beautiful. So there we are, the two cultures. We just thought we'd merge them for a while. Brian, I just want to pick up on something you were saying, because I think it's worth having this conversation again for those who didn't see the Andrew Marr show. I'm sure many people on social media have found themselves in kind of arguments where, when they've been talking about the handling of the current crisis, and they've just had someone reply, but they've just been following the science. And I thought what you were talking about on Andrew Marr this morning was an important point about a misunderstanding of when we sometimes just see follow the science thrown out as a rebuttal.
Yeah, I mean, there are a series of ways we could talk about this subject. I mean, one is a very simple point that scientific advice to government comes from many quarters. And as I said on the Andrew Marr show, the thing about this virus, and Matthew will comment more widely, I suppose, on this from the biology, but we've only known about it for 4 months. It's only been in humans for 5 months or something like that. So we've made tremendous progress. But I think it's true to say we don't have a full understanding by any means of how it behaves, but we don't have treatments that have been shown to work. We don't have a vaccine yet. And so the advice from scientists is going to be from many quarters, from social scientists, behavioral scientists and epidemiologists and so on. And it's surely true, as with all scientific advice to government, that ultimately, therefore, government has to take the overview. That's, we do, after all, live in a democracy. Scientists do not decide how people should behave, and rightly so. And so there's that level of point that we should make, that it's not, I don't think it's appropriate for government, the people who take the decisions, to do what they did, which is take a decision, which they have to do. And I must say, it's tremendously difficult. I don't envy any of them, and I'm not criticising any of them. Very difficult. But they have to acknowledge, I think, that they're making decisions. They are making them based on the evidence and the advice and so on, and what you might call politics or judgment. I mean, and so that's point number one. But point number two, which was the deeper point I was making, is that there is no such thing as the science, particularly in an area like this, where you've got great uncertainty, active research. It's not because scientists don't know anything, it's because this is an area that it's new and it's unknown. And that's what scientists do. They, as Feynman said in that great essay, the most valuable thing probably that a scientist can teach a non-scientist is this incredible experience of the unknown, right? Because that's where you work, right? We are research scientists. And so I think he said, I can't remember his wording, you might remember it, but it's something like, we have a very great experience with the unknown, and that's perhaps the most valuable thing. And then he goes on to make a different point, which I think is a very beautiful point. It doesn't really apply in this case because of the seriousness of the unknown. But he celebrates the idea that there are things yet to be discovered rather than fear. He says doubt is to be embraced rather than fear. Now, that's another point. It's slightly wrong to make that point in this case, because we desperately need to know. So it's not to be, the unknown is not to be celebrated in this case. So I think there are many, many complex layers to this argument. And of course, as you said, I had about 1 minute to mention it on Marr, but I think I got the point across. That my main point was that it's just not really appropriate to say, well, we're just following the science, because there isn't such a thing as the science in this case.
But it's really interesting. So in the past few weeks, a friend of mine has been reading out Daniel Defoe's Journal of a Plague Year, which is talking about the Great Plague of London in 1665, whenever it was. And what's interesting is that, so they don't have any of the science, but they have all of the same politics. And it's really fascinating to read, because it could be the modern day arguments about who's responsible for spreading, who makes the decisions. Like, everything is identical except for the science. And it's really instructive, I think, because in a sense, they're left with a lot of the same decisions made for some of the same reasons. We have much better tools, but they had humans, and it's the humans that are the same, even though the disease and the knowledge of it is different.
Yeah, I've kind of taken a vow not to try and get too excited about the latest discovery with the virus, because it's just so confusing. So if you just think of the basic things we know, old people get it, young people apparently don't die of it, or much less likely to. Men are much more likely to get it and to die from it than women. And also the effects on BAME populations, which are repeated throughout the world. So what is going on there? There are those three basic facts we don't have any explanation for at the moment. So, I think Brian's absolutely right. There is no single answer. And the arguments that will have taken place inside the SAGE committee, I think it'd be very useful if we could see what those arguments were, because we will then see that there wasn't a view. There'll have been multiple views with different, seeing what, especially when you're dealing with something with real political consequences, not like what we all deal with, which is, it's just intellectually fascinating, but it doesn't actually make any difference. This is actually really, really serious. And I agree with Brian. I'm sure we've all had a hard time being able to think in this current mess. And then there are people who are actually having to think really hard about the science. And then also the politicians who've got to come up with a decision. And I'm very glad I'm not involved in that at all, because I think it must be very, very hard.
And it is worth, I should say, there are certain people on social media who are working in this area, and it's worth finding that people like Dr. Rupert Beale, because they are putting up, they're giving you a lot of different pieces of information, and they're information which they will only put up if it has some level of reliability, even if it's the reliability of doubt, as it often is. But I think it's really worth, as opposed to newspapers and columnists and those kind of things. Right, we're going to move deeper into the universe, and we will come back, and we're going to, as I said, I think Trent and I are going to sort another special with various virologists, etc., and people working in this field at the moment. I'll start off with you, Brian. This is from James. If a photon travelling at light speed experiences no passage of time, how can it make sense that it takes light 8 minutes to reach us from the sun? That's a fascinating thing, that when you get to a certain scale, time is just so can you explain to James that idea?
Yeah, it's a basic property of relativity. So basically, Einstein's special theory of relativity is what we're talking about now, and it's a property of the fabric of the universe, which we call space-time, which is kind of often described as a mixture of space and time. Essentially, the point is that the way we measure distances in space-time, so that's a distance between things that happen. So technically, we call them events. So let's say that, as I said on our live shows, Robin, that an event might be your alarm clock going off when you wake up in the morning. That's something that happened by some definition somewhere in space and somewhere in time. And another event later on might be you switching the light off when you go to bed that evening. So that's another event. Now, the distance between those two events, not surprisingly, depends on the path that you take, right? I mean, that's how we think about distances in space. But the thing is that light takes a different path between those events to the path that we take. Because it's massless, actually, because they're massless particles. So the distance in space-time between those two events is different for people who take a different path. So that's the origin of this idea that moving clocks run slow. It says, that idea that if you fly off to Alpha Centauri in a rocket and come back again, then you'll be younger than the person who stayed on Earth. The whole point is that you're taking different paths between events in space-time. And it turns out that the geometry of space-time itself is such that photons, so light, massless particles, travel a path that has zero length between events. So that's the counterintuitive geometry of space-time. And by the way, the other last thing I'll say is that the distance you travel between two events is the time measured on your watch. So that's another way of saying it, actually. So if you say, how far did I travel over space-time between getting up this morning and going to bed at night? The answer is, if you started a stopwatch when you got up and stopped it when you went to bed, and it said 18 hours and 4 minutes and 3 seconds, that is the distance you traveled between those events. So that's the way that Einstein's theory works. And to finally answer the question, and the distance traveled by a photon is zero.
It is such a. I remember when we did a show about Einstein, and looking at it, and that first point where.
The other very simple thing to say is that so the point is that we're looking at things from different vantage points. So you're asking from the vantage point of the photon. Then, as we say, this famous result that no time passes. So the distance between any 2 points from the view of a photon is zero. But the distance from someone who watches it is the vantage point from us on the Earth, right? So we're saying, what's the distance we travelled from the emission event on the sun to the reception event in our eyes? And the answer to that will be 8 minutes.
Right. The good thing is, Matthew, your question is it's in a different field, but still that, because I always find that thing where thinking about that whatever speed you're traveling, your neural processes, your metabolism, everything changes with that speed. So, that thing where as I watch all of my relatives getting very, very old as I move at incredible speed away from the planet Earth, and the experience I have. But the fact that to me is an incredible counterinstinctual thing as well. But this is now, does colour only happen in brains is the question for you, Matt. And again, I think when people find out these kind of ideas, that the redness of red is not a primary property. That seems to be a remarkable thing. So tell us about colour and sensory experience. Which ones can we say, well, this is your perception?
Oh, crikey.
I told you it was going to be a tricky one, didn't I?
Well, I mean, colour's real. So let's start that. So it's not imaginary, right? So there are differences in the wavelengths that are absorbed by matter. And so, for example, green leaves are green because they've absorbed all the energy except the green wavelength, which then gets thrown back. And that's what we perceive when you see something as green. Now, different eyes from different animals can perceive different wavelengths. So lots of animals can see in what to us is invisible in the ultraviolet wavelength. So they can see things that are beyond that dark blue purple at the end of the rainbow. There is something at the end of the rainbow. It's not gold. It's unimaginable for us, variations that we're unable to see. And similarly at the other end, we can't see it. We can see a very, very narrow part of the electromagnetic spectrum. But as to the perception of it and whether redness is the same for me as it is for another person, that's much more difficult to tell. And there are different arguments about quite how confident we can be about that. We know, from example, with people who are what we call colorblind. So if you're red-green colorblind, it means you can't distinguish red and green. They look the same to you. And that's kind of unimaginable if you can distinguish them. And the opposite is equally true. Imagining what those different colors might be like is something that's very, very mysterious if you can't perceive them. That isn't an answer to the question.
It really does bother people, though, doesn't it? I made a series about the physics of colour a few years ago.
Yeah, it's great. We saw on BBC 4 recently.
And fully 50%, I got hundreds of questions, and fully 50% of them were, is the red that you see the same as the red that I see? It really bothers people, the idea that it might not be. And I would say, of course, it's not the same, because there's this thing called colour constancy. Your brain is adjusting all the time, that if you walk into a room which is lit differently, the wavelengths coming to your eye are different, but your brain interprets that a banana is still yellow. And that's why that image of the dress a few years ago bothered everyone so much, because their brains were adjusting for lighting, making different assumptions about the lighting. And it absolutely showed that they were all making it up in their heads. But it really bothered people because it matters so much, because if you can't trust that someone else sees the same thing that you see, what else can you trust, right? It really does get to people, that one.
So in terms of perception, then, in terms of the spectrum that we can see, we basically is it possible to just say that has evolved because this is what we need to see? That there will be other creatures that their evolved senses, they see a different world because that is what is required for so in terms of through evolution, our ability to perceive is based on our ability to survive, and therefore something else might have a totally different picture because of the world or the environment it lives in.
Yeah, and it also relates to the signals. So if you think about it, are there any animals that can detect radio? Not as far as I know. What would it be like if you had a radio, if you could detect radio signals? I mean, you'd have to have a huge, great big receptor things, like an aerial or an antenna, dish on your head to be able to pick them up. And there's nothing that's emitting those signals naturally, so there's no selection pressure to actually be able to detect it.
Yeah, I remember once someone saying that you could imagine an animal that could see the radio emission from the galaxies, but its eyes would be as big as Jodrell Bank.
Yeah,
no problem.
We're just getting some questions in from the live feed as well. So I'm going to come back to the ones that have been emailed in. This is someone wanted to know whether your cat is real or a prop cat. Obviously, it's moving around, so that's just a very simple question. Or I say simple, but their perception of your cat may be different to your perception of
Poor cat was having a nice nap.
This is Harry. Say hello to everybody, Harry. He's very rotund.
Oh, you should never show a physicist a cat. You know the rules. This one's from. I think this is for you, Helen, because this is picking up on last week. Last week we were talking about the longevity of bubbles, and someone has been thinking about this for the whole week, and they wanted to know. They said, "Can we count? What about a bubble that exists inside a pumice stone? Why is that no longer defined as a bubble?"
So it's one of those cases where there is a scientific definition of a bubble, and then there's a general popular definition of a bubble. And the scientific definition of a bubble is a gas surrounded by liquid. So it's both the gas and the liquid. It's really important for the properties of bubbles that it's not just about the gas. Most of their properties come from the interaction between the gas that's inside the bubble and the liquid on the outside. But there is a popular definition of a bubble, which is a pocket of gas. That's what I would call it, inside a solid. So when it comes to pumice stone, what's happening there is that you have lava that is coming out, and as it comes out of the earth, the pressure drops, and so dissolved gases that were inside the liquid, just like when you take the top off a bottle of lemonade, they form bubbles. The gas comes out of solution, it forms separate bubbles, and then they are bubbles because it's still liquid. But when it goes solid, like an aero bar, and they're trapped, then I would say that is now a pocket of gas rather than a bubble.
Right.
Could you say it was a fossil bubble?
I think if you wanted to stretch literary description, I mean, the good ones are the ones that were in ice, right? That have actually come out, that are in glaciers that never were bubbles at any point, but they look like bubbles because they're trapped in a transparent ice, and that you can get samples of past atmospheres in them trapped, but they weren't round to start with, so they've never been a bubble, but they look awfully like bubbles.
So we'll deal with fobbles more next week, Matthew. This is from Ed. Ed would like to know how much of an overlap is there in the sort of quantum physics that Brian has been talking about before and the real world physics Helen does. So that's an interesting thing, the idea of a nice, neat dividing line between quantum physics and then where the ones, Newtonian physics. So Brian, how do we work out those kind of divisions of understanding?
Well, there isn't really a division at a fundamental level. Everything is quantum, the idea. The point is, though, and I think we've mentioned Sean Carroll several times. I think he's written some great, but he always makes this point that we're talking about different levels of description. So if we're talking about atoms, then it is necessary to understand quantum mechanics and do quantum mechanics. This goes all the way up to even as Helen works in, for example, the way materials emit and absorb light. That's all quantum mechanics. You need to understand quantum mechanics. But really, if you're trying to talk about a living system, then it's not appropriate to talk about the atoms and molecules. As Matthew said, we don't even know how to. If you said simulate a neuron, starting with the building blocks of a neuron, no chance. And there's no point. It's completely pointless. So I would say that quantum mechanics in physics, it is the framework, the basic framework within we understand the universe in a deep sense. However, it is not necessary or appropriate to apply it to things like living systems.
But the tools you use in the two cases are very different. So in all physics problems, you have all the forces in the universe, right? You have all kinds of electromagnetic forces, you have all, gravity, you have a whole list. And what happens in practice is that if you want to predict what's going on, what you do as a physicist is you rank all those things, and then you start at the top and you think about the top one, the most important one, and then you kind of add extra ones as you go down. And the models and the tools you need to do that are different for classical physics. So most of it, I kind of think of physics as split into two halves. There's the bits at either end, which you could say crudely are the bits that Brian does. There's quantum mechanics and cosmology, right? Big bits and small bits that join together around the back if you're in a black hole. And then there's all this stuff in the middle, but the stuff in the middle is about complexity. It's not about fundamental principles. We've dealt with all of those. What it's about is the complexity you get when you have lots of these forces that are all active at the same time. So instead of just being able to say, we're going to worry about gravity, and perhaps radiative pressure to deal with a star, you have to worry about 5 or 6 different things, and they're all kind of jostling with each other for which takes priority. And it's that complexity which means there's a whole other area of physics in the middle, which I would call the mesoscale, I guess, or the messy bit in the middle, which is generally what I call it, where it's complicated in a different way. The hierarchy is somewhere else completely, but you need different tools to study it. And of course, I've got a chip on my shoulder because I think a lot of people don't think of physics when they think of that stuff, but it absolutely is physics. And actually, some of it's harder than cosmology. Quite a lot of it. Turbulence is definitely harder than cosmology.
Oh, thank heavens for the fact we're not in the same room. This one's for sorry.
I just want to agree completely. I mean, the point is, as we've talked about, complexity. When you start getting huge numbers of molecules and atoms or people, right, interacting together, then you need a whole different. You use different mathematics. You need different approximations, and so Helen's absolutely right. I'd go even further and say that I don't like this description which often gets made of fundamental physics against applied physics. So I think that just misunderstands the nature of these problems, which are just different problems.
Matthew, we're going to move back to brains now. This is from Stephen's daughter, Elise, and she would like to know, how do we get the two brains, one rational and one emotional? I'd like to know, is there any... so there we go. So why is it... So Elise is wondering where it seems sometimes like we have different brains within our own head.
Yeah, so, I mean, there's two things there. One, our everyday experience is of, say, wanting to do something that you may want to do very impulsively, and then saying, well, no, I perhaps shouldn't do that because it wouldn't be very good for me or whatever. So we've got these competing desires and ways of thinking in our head. And that's a bit different from saying actually bits about your brain. So people do get taught, and there's a lot of pop psychology books which would say you've got a left brain and a right brain. They're doing completely different things. That, I'm afraid, just isn't true. There's one thing that is different as far as we know on the two sides of the brain, and that's what I'm doing now, and that's speech. And speech is controlled by this bit of your brain on the left-hand side, and that is different. But all the psychological things we talk about are, in fact, distributed across the brain. And so although people often talk about left brain, right brain, often then gets blurred into male-female differences. I mean, that just isn't true. Now, one of the interesting things is, well, why have we got two sides to our brain anyway? Why are all brains kind of got these two hemispheres, these two lumps? And that goes back to actually what a brain is, which is ultimately just a load of neurons at the head of an animal. It's partly what makes a head. And when animals first developed what's called bilateral symmetry, so they got two sides. So you've maybe got, say, an eye patch on one side and on the other. That means you can detect light coming, you can detect a predator, you can get away. And then the neurons getting signals from those receptors tend to get together. And you now know I'm going somewhere. I've got a front and a back. You've got head and tail. So one of the mysteries of biology is this moment when you get bilateral symmetry. So you get two sides to your body. And at the same time, you get head-tail asymmetry. So your head and your tail are very different. You've got a mouth and you've got an anus. And those are kind of key steps in the evolution of life. But ultimately, we've got those two sides because way back, you're simply wanting to know which side of the environment a stimulus is coming from, either to escape becoming food, or to find food.
And there's some wonderful experiments, aren't there, as well, with the corpus callosum, when the period of time where an operation to sever the corpus callosum, I think because it was predominantly due to things like seizures, wasn't it?
Yeah. So this is some of those bizarre things that are found. This kind of gives rise to this idea of there being two sides to our brain. So in the 1950s and 1960s, a lot of people who suffered from extremely severe epilepsy, the only way of dealing with it before drugs became available was actually to chop the two sides of your brain in half to separate all those connections. And people who've had this happen to them behave apparently perfectly normally. And then cunning psychologists realized that, in fact, the two sides of their brain each had a different mind presence in there that had slightly different characters. The right-hand side of the brain can't speak, because it hasn't got control of this part of the brain. And the left-hand side of the brain can speak, so it could answer questions. The right-hand side of the brain and the left-hand side of the brain sometimes took different attitudes about moral questions if you asked them these two things they had in their mind. But the key point is not to think, okay, well, I've got these two bits of my head, bits of my mind in normal circumstances, because normally it's all integrated. And what's happened is the operation shows that the mind, in some mysterious, amazing way, emerges from all those neurons. And because the neurons are slightly different on either side, if you separate them, you end up with these slightly different, rather odd things, presences, minds, who knows what we can call them. It is one of the weirdest experiments. It's not an experiment, it's an operation. It wasn't done to intendedly for that to happen. One of the most extraordinary findings in the history of science, I think. And these very, very brave patients who, literally went under the knife, and then their symptoms were relieved, which was the point of it all, but they also emerged with these very strange heads.
It's that remarkable thing, isn't it, where the left brain is doing up the buttons of a shirt and the right brain is undoing it, and that is some of those examples are just fascinating.
When they start off, when they initially happens, they sometimes have the two sides of the head of these people were having arguments as to whether they should be putting their trousers on or not. So their arms would be kind of struggling. Eventually, it all calmed down.
Why do we come out? Sorry, Brian.
Can I just say, I mean, this operation isn't a complete severing, is it? Can't be, can it? Because you can't sever.
There are subcortical layers, so it's going right very, very deep down. So most of the connection between the two sides of the brain is separated, but there are subcortical layers.
Yeah.
So you have two complete kind of bits of your brain.
So in some sense, is the brain work? Does it reconnect with its other half over time?
No,
reconnect down through.
No, it doesn't seem to get any better or worse. It's just once this happens, then that's the way it is. And they're all very old now. They're all in their 70s, and people don't do the operation anymore. So we've had this kind of window of insight, and it'll be passing soon. But it is absolutely extraordinary.
And there's some wonderful footage of it. Alan Alda did a great documentary with looking at some of those. I have to find that. I wish I knew what it was online. We'll try and put up a link on this afterwards. But it's really beautiful. Yeah, and Alan Alda is always a joy to watch. Anyway, this is from David, just been sent in now. This is for you, Brian. I think really sometimes heat is described as electromagnetic radiation, sometimes as the jigglingness of atoms. Which is correct? Is it electromagnetic radiation, or is it jigglingness, or is it a little bit of both?
So you're talking about one of the most difficult to teach areas of physics, which is the thermodynamics. So what is temperature? So when people say heat is, what were the two questions?
Is it electromagnetic radiation or is it jigglingness?
It's sort of energy. So in a sense, if you're talking about temperature, broadly speaking, if you've got a liquid in a glass, let's say, then you can say what's the temperature of the glass and of the liquid. It's related to the average speed of the jiggling of the molecules in some sense. But I keep saying in some sense because it's actually gets tremendously complicated very quickly. But if you read a textbook, just if you go and get any book, Peter Atkins, the great Oxford chemist, wrote a brilliant little introductory book which you can get on Kindle for about £1, I think. One of those short introductions to thermodynamics. And you read that, and the care you have to go through to define what you mean by temperature and what it is and its relation to entropy and order and information and all this stuff is tremendously subtle. But broadly speaking, yes. So temperatures are, you could say it's a measure of the amount that atoms are jiggling around. So the higher the temperature of the liquid, the faster the atoms are jiggling. And I think when you said about light, I think you're probably referring to what's called color temperature. And Helen will comment on this as well, I think. But color temperature is you're talking about the wavelengths of light that are emitted from a hot object. And so when you say if you're a photographer and you say the color temperature is 6,000 degrees, let's say, what you're talking about is the kind of, broadly speaking, or correctly to say, as you go hotter, then the wavelengths that are emitted tend to get smaller, and the energy of the light emitted tends to get higher. So that means you go to the bluer end of the spectrum. So you've got something that's hot enough so you can see it glowing, but it's not too hot, then it'll glow in the red. And as you increase temperature, so there's more energy in that object, then the light emitted will go to the blue end of the spectrum. So that, I think, is what you're talking about with light.
But it is the case, I think, to make the distinction in the question that once it's electromagnetic radiation all by itself. It's not heat. So the thing that is distinctive about it is that the mixture of wavelengths you have in it tell you it probably came from something with a temperature. Yeah. But once they're traveling, they're just electromagnetic waves, and it's the object itself. It is the statistical movement of the atoms and molecules within it, and how they share movement energy with each other that defines temperature. So once the energy has left it and has gone off, it's then just electromagnetic radiation. If you measured one photon of that, it could have come from anywhere. So at that point, I would say it's not heat.
Well, we've got another question now for you, which I think is one of the hotly contended areas in biology, really, which is the belly button. Don't worry, it's not do Adam and Eve have belly buttons. This is from Helen's youngest child, and her youngest child would like to know how many animals that live in the ocean have belly buttons.
Oh, well, so this is not my child, by the way. Different.
Sorry. Otherwise, she could have asked you earlier. You're right.
So a belly button is something that placental mammals have. So the belly button is where the umbilical cord connects. And so in order to have a belly button, I think you need to be an umbilical mammal. And that means that the things in the ocean that have them will be the dolphins, whales, which were mammals, which were land mammals and have all the organs that land mammals have, and then went back into the ocean and still give live birth. So I don't think there are any, and sharks have live birth, but I don't think they have an equivalent of an umbilical cord. So I don't think that they will have a belly button. But although I've been very close to quite a lot of sharks, I have to confess not having looked in great detail. So it's the mammals in the ocean that will have belly buttons.
Well, we've just got thank you
seals.
For that.
Seals.
Oh, seals. Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Thank you very much, by the way, everyone who sent those questions in. We've got a few more questions. Just a reminder, we have a tip jar at the bottom. We're trying to build up a resource for the funding of people in the performing arts who, at the moment, have kind of not merely fallen on hard times, but are finding it quite hard to access any kind of way to get money, and also the arts centres. And also, we're trying to make sure that we've got the resources to keep making these shows for free, because we're doing about 11 or 12 shows quite often a week, and just to keep all of that going as well, and to make sure. So you don't feel under no pressure to donate any money whatsoever. I realise many people are in a precarious situation, but if you do think, but you know what, I'm still doing all right, then if you fancy it, why not? And so this is a question about pandas, so I'm going to throw this one to you, Matthew. I know this is from Jack. Jack would like to know, I read recently that red pandas have been discovered to be two separate species, Chinese and Himalayan red pandas. What, if anything, are the implications of that? Also, I remember from school learning that a definition of species involved animals that can breed, but as far as I'm aware, the two species can breed, at least in captivity. Was I taught wrongly at school? So the species divide, another big question, I suppose, really, in biology.
Yeah, so basically taxonomists, people who define species, are divided into two groups, as it should be, and they're either splitters or lumpers. They either put lots of different groups together, or they want to have them all kind of separate. And that is especially true for paleontology, so dealing with fossils, because we don't actually know what those animals or plants, how they interacted. But the biological definition for a currently living organism would be exactly that. Can they successfully interbreed? Now, then you've got a problem with, there are some populations that are separate geographically, so they never meet in the wild. But when we put them together, they can in fact produce fertile offspring, not just an offspring, but fertile offspring that can carry on reproducing. So technically, they wouldn't be different species. But I think when they are clearly separated geographically, then I think that's probably okay. That having been said, what difference does it make? There's been a lot of argument about this, for example, over the giraffe. How many giraffe species are there? 3? Are there 7? Are what are often called subspecies, really different species? And people often use DNA studies to try and demonstrate this. The problem is you can't really show from DNA whether it's a species or two groups are two different species or not. But the argument is that by focusing attention on how many there are or differences between them, you may be actually able to encourage or help conservation efforts. So there may be not some politics, but there may help encourage splitters who want to identify two different groups as being completely different species, because that would mean, well, we've got to do everything we can to save them. We can't just think, oh, well, to be honest, it's all the same thing. It doesn't really matter.
Thank you very much. This near the end now, I'm going to ask. Helen, you might have an opinion on this as well. I'll start with you, though, Brian. This is about Elon Musk. Many people will have seen in the last week the satellites that have been going up. It's been a fantastic week, in fact, for the night sky generally. And this person would like to know, I haven't got a name for this, which was Elon Musk planned to send up 12,000 satellites. Are we any closer to having a solution to clearing up obsolete space junk in our orbit? Brian, I'll start with you.
No, I don't think we are. It's thought about because it is dangerous and or expensive. So it's dangerous if you're an astronaut. I think the International Space Station moves quite often to get out of the way of space junk. We track it all. We know where it is. But of course, you can have problems if two things bump into each other. There's a rather random spreading of all that stuff. And you only need flecks of paint to damage the space station or to take out a communication satellite. You know, the things are moving that fast and with that much energy in orbit. So no, we don't really have I think a global agreement. I mean, there's a lot of controversy, and I think rightly so, about the SpaceX satellites. I mean, on one level, they're doing a good thing. They're providing internet access, which is very important for people. But on another level, they are, at the moment anyway, causing real problems for our view of the night sky, which is a natural resource. And the question of who is responsible, who is the voice of the conservationist, I suppose, in the sense of conserving our view of the night sky, it's not clear to me. So I think that there are big questions around international management and regulation of who can put what into orbit and where, and how we deal with problems when they occur, as they inevitably will.
Yeah, and I think if you speak to the people who track satellites, and of course there are more and more of them as there are more and more bits of thing in space, they say it's more or less a question of when and not if. Like, because all it takes is one accident, and the more, I think at the moment there is something like 5,000 or 6,000 things in orbit that are supposed to be there. And Elon Musk and the people who are talking about CubeSats and all those sorts of things, all these really cool bits of technology, they're talking about adding tens of thousands at a time, which is more than double what we've got already in a single batch, if you like. And so, and the thing is that there does become a limit to the amount you can track. So that's one thing. There's the point at which it only takes one collision of just the wrong sort that nudges something into something else, that nudges something into 3 more collisions, that nudges something into 100 more collisions. And you've taken down the entire global satellite system. Not to panic anybody. I'm sure someone's writing a disaster movie about this already. But the other thing that matters actually is the bandwidth that they use. So satellites communicate with Earth and with each other at specific wavelengths. And there are already Earth observation satellites in orbit that use some of those wavelengths to detect things about our planet, for example. And some of those are getting crowded out in the same way that the astronomers are getting crowded out by satellites, all these new little satellites using the same, starting to push into their frequency band and knocking out the sensitivity of some of our weather measurements. So there's a very severe, at the moment it's going to happen because, like Brian said, no one seems to be in charge. No one's going to stop them. We are going to lose some of our weather observations if the rates, if all the CubeSat and Elon Musk and all these people keep putting this stuff up, we're cutting down the satellite bandwidth available for other things. So there are quite a few problems associated with this. And it isn't at all clear how to fix it. Because if one of them goes, if this starts happening, we rely on satellites so much now that we do have a real problem. So, yeah, it's very much, and all these people who are keen on tech are so mixed about it because they're like, oh, it's really cool because there's cool new technology. And then there's like, but. And yeah, there's nowhere really for that to go. Someone has to start making decisions.
I'm really annoyed that we've actually run out of time because there's still so many. I'll just, if we can do this quickly, I don't know if we'll be able to. Thank you so much. We've had so many questions. Sorry we didn't get to deal with all of those questions. Dr. Carl can answer some of them on Tuesday as well then. This one I just like. This is from Melanie. She wants to know, what's the most fascinating thing you've accidentally stumbled over, learnt about each other's fields? And I think that's because I know that certainly Brian and Matthew, you've worked together, haven't you, on a project? And are those moments of going in, and we've certainly had that on Monkey Cage occasionally, where something biological based, and you've there are those wonderful moments where your mind can still be blown.
Yeah, I worked with Matthew. He was very kind to work with me on Wonders of Life years ago, which is one of the most enjoyable, if not the most enjoyable thing I've done in terms of television, because I learnt a huge amount about biology that I'd never known, or even the basics I'd forgotten. And the thing that stayed with me, that when I realized that really, and Matthew will probably correct me here, but what I loved was this sense in which our ecosystem, right, the living environment is essentially one great genetic database. And it's subdivided off into little bits, as Matthew was talking about, species and things like that. But when you realize that the whole thing carries, in a sense, a single book of information that's subdivided up into little bits. And it was really important to me because it tells you that it's, again, our lack of understanding, it tells you that it's very difficult to identify what will happen if you damage or move or change one bit of it. It's the absolute interconnectedness of our ecosystem and of life on Earth was something that I hadn't thought about.
I think for me, again, working on that series, what it stressed to me as having failed my O-level physics was quite how significant. I mean, I knew it, but talking to Brian, discussing things, how significant the physical framing of evolution is and life on Earth. So I remember a couple of things you asked me. Well, what's the limit on how tall a tree could go? And I didn't know. And you worked out. I mean, I'm not sure it's entirely true, but there is a limit, even if you had the strongest tree possible. And that limit is the bonds in the water molecule. There come a certain point at which it would break, and that is just fantastic. Or going back to colour of plants, I think you said to me, "Why aren't plant leaves black?" Because, of course, you get all the energy. So, I mean, my hand wavy answer is, well, they get too hot and the proteins would denature. I've no idea if that's true or not. But that the fact that evolution could do virtually anything, but only within the frameworks of the laws of physics. And that, I think, is what really, and that's why I think it's such a good series, because the two things were completely intermingled at every step. And we had a physicist's view on biology, which was, I found immensely stimulating.
Yeah, I love this right at the end of the last episode. I think about all these things that we're about. And there's a little piece where I just said that if you look at a blade of grass, it's pretty much true that most of the history of life on Earth is written into it, which I think is just this idea of the information storage system of life is really worth thinking about. There's not a great deal of difference, right? And you see, between a blade of grass is that it's, broadly speaking, the information database is pretty shared between us, isn't it?
Yep. Helen, what about in terms of in another area?
Well, for me, I'm not going to pick between the two, right? Because it's not really fair. But the thing that I feel better about now, and this is I feel it's a good thing, and I see more of it, is this kind of humility. Because what made me very pissed off when I was going to do physics all the way, I did that, and then I moved into a branch of physics which does involve all these different fields, and I met so many physicists who were like, what is all of that nonsense? Just pretend it's all a sphere. And I met a lot of biologists who just thought physics was nonsense. And I work, like I study bubbles under breaking waves. I can't do that job without chemistry and biology, and more important than that, I can't do it without biologists and chemists working with me. And so the thing that I like learning now from other people that I have learned less of in the past is that other fields are starting to learn some humility, and there's less of this, I have the framework which explains the world and you can all go away and shut up, and much more of, oh, maybe I'm grown up enough to admit that I don't know something. And I see that as a good thing. So Brilliant. I like hearing it from different fields, because it's reassuring that everyone isn't forgetting that they're not all king of the world. And let's note that it is usually kings and not queens of the world in this historical analogy.
Thank you very much.
Said that. You can approximate a head as a sphere, can't you? That brain thing. It's very... And it's got
that famous physics and biology. Well, first take a spherical cow.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all very much. Helen will be back next week. We'll be doing another Sunday Science Q&A at 3 p.m. We'll also have news up very, very soon about the next panel we're going to do about COVID-19 as well. I heartily recommend Matthew's book. I read it. I think it's brilliant. I'm going to actually read it again. And we're going to do. The fact is, I don't think it's gone out yet. We did an interview on Book Shambles as well, an hour-long interview about the book. That will be up soon. If you want to join our Patreon, by the way, we literally have thousands and thousands of hours hours of art and science and music-based things that we've done, and that we're as well as everything that we're creating specifically for what's going on at the moment, we're still trying to create all the other things that we do as well. So your support is welcome, and I thank you very much for it. I will also Human Universe. I just read that again. You're right, Brian. I think it's your favourite book, isn't it, Brian?
Yeah, that and Wonders of Life. I mean, as I said, Wonders of Life I really enjoyed because it's such an intellectual challenge to try and get across and write about. As Matthew said at the start, writing about a subject that is not your own is challenging and fun.
So all of those, and Storm in a Teacup as well, which is a wonderful book by Helen, because it does connect it to the things very often that you see every single day, and then you go, there is physics in that. That's one of the great things.
Where I write about the maximum height of trees.
Yeah, of course, and the tree height copy. It's got the whole thing.
Just one inappropriate units. Just one. Spherical and trees.
A normalised tree. Brilliant.
Thanks very much, everyone, for watching. We're back tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. with Mark Gatiss, and I forget which. I think we have a musical guest with Mark as well. And on Tuesday we have Dr. Carl. So if you have any questions for Dr. Carl, send them to us via the website or via my Twitter, Facebook, anything like that. We're going to end today with 1201 Alarm. You may well have seen them if you've watched this before. Here is a new song from them. They are absolutely wonderful, and again, another thing to support them on Bandcamp. I think on the 1st of May, by the way, everyone, Bandcamp are doing another of those days where they take no money whatsoever. The money that you give to when you're buying artist work will go entirely to the artist. So if you're about to buy something on Bandcamp, wait till the 1st of May, because I think they're going to do that again. Thanks very much. I'll see some of you tomorrow.